My name is Kate Paisani. I'm the director of CARLA, and I want to thank you for coming today. We know that you have lots of choices for professional development, so we really appreciate you choosing this event. Our presenter today is Lauren Truman. She is a PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese Studies here at the University of Minnesota and a good friend of Carla's. She's been a summer research assistant for us a couple of times, and she's been a CARLA fellow. And we're really excited to hear her talk about her dissertation research today. The topic of her presentation is language use patterns in a Spanish immersion algebra class, opportunities, uptake, and individual learner variables. We will leave the chat open while Lauren is speaking, but just please know that she will handle Q&A at the end of the presentation when you can ask questions in the chat, and we'll also invite folks to raise their hand if you want to ask your question orally. So I'll go ahead and hand things over to Lauren. Thanks for being here, Lauren.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. So my interest in Spanish immersion began a few years ago when a friend of mine became the English teacher in a Spanish-English dual immersion program. And she started talking about her struggles in the program, struggles with having enough time. Well, I guess she was teaching the English side, but struggles in general in the program with having enough time in Spanish, especially when they had to factor in differentiated learning, trouble feeling or issues feeling supported by the school and by the district, and just generally feeling stretched thin. And so I started becoming more interested in these dynamics and doing more research in this area and coursework in this area. And in one of my courses, I came to know a high school teacher of a Spanish advanced algebra class. And through our discussions and through my research, I became interested in students' language use patterns in secondary math and science classes, partly because there is not a lot of research in this area, and partly because the content of this context in math and science, it's not language focused, and so it makes it a little more difficult for students to produce as much rich language as they might in like a language arts class, for instance. So I arranged with this teacher to come and observe and audio record her class, and her class became the subject of the study. So this class is part of a dual language immersion program in which academic instruction is provided in both Spanish and English beginning in pre-K. So in pre-K through first grade, 90% of the instruction is delivered in Spanish, and after first grade, instruction time in English increases incrementally through the grades until in fifth grade, students receive 50% of their instruction in English and 50% in Spanish. And when these DLI students enter middle school, they then take only 2 classes in Spanish, reducing their instruction time from about 50% to about 30%. Both Spanish home language and English home language students participate in this program. The idea behind this model being that students, when they learn with other students from other language backgrounds, they can each learn their target language with peers who are native speakers of that language. Dual language immersion has been shown to be generally very successful in helping students achieve high levels of competence in their target language while also developing their first language. And studies also show that students who participate in these programs tend to have positive sociocultural attitudes and towards native speakers of their target language, and that these programs help minority language speakers maintain their heritage language. Students in these programs also consistently perform at or above grade level in both reading and math. And one of the linguistic benefits of these DLI programs is that students learn content through their target languages, and each subject area can potentially provide students with a variety of opportunities to use different functions, different structures, and different vocabulary. So for example, math instruction tends to prompt the use of present tense, both active voice and passive voice, while social studies tends to lend itself more to using the past tense. However, some subjects may also lead to less minority language use and or less complex minority language use. So Broner notes that when students discuss math together, They tend to use less complex language than when discussing language arts or science. And she suggests that this may be due to the context in which students are speaking. So in her 2000 study of a fifth grade Spanish immersion classroom, she found that students were often producing only 1 or 2 word tokens during math time because most of these tokens occurred during directions from the teacher, during whole group activities, and during follow-ups to activities. So Broner and Teddick expound on this study, and they point out that the teacher herself did not model complex Spanish speech, and the students could get by without using complex sentences that involved a verb. And these factors may have contributed to students' increased use of English during math instruction. So in addition to the subject, the interlocutor also has an effect on students' use of Spanish and English, so the person that they're talking to. So for example, in Patowski's study of fifth grade dual immersion students, she found that when students were talking with the teacher, which made up almost half of their speech, they used Spanish 82% of the time. But when talking with each other, they only used Spanish about 32% of the time. And Broner also found that the fifth graders in her study used much more Spanish with the teacher than when talking with each other. The task, or what I refer to as a speech function of a token, can also affect students' use of Spanish and English. So a task is a goal-oriented activity in which participants must carry out. And so when communication is on task, it means it's directly related to the completion of the task at hand. Whereas when it's off task, it's completely unrelated to the task at hand. So off task, our studies show that being on task, tends to prompt Spanish use among students, while being off task tends to prompt English use, as does managing an activity. And managing an activity might be, you go first, or I'll go next, or give me that, or things like that. Tyrone and Swain refer to this division of language use as a diglossic situation in which English is used for social purposes and Spanish is used for academic purposes. Fortune pushes against this notion of diglossia, saying that the reality is actually more nuanced. So her 2001 study of 4 fifth graders in a Spanish immersion class found that English interactions were academic almost a quarter of the time, while Spanish interactions were academically oriented only about half of the time. So the studies cited up until now only focus on elementary school programs. And as Bierce and de Jong point out, the issues that arise in an elementary school program are likely to continue in a secondary program. However, the research in secondary programs is scarce. One thing we do know about secondary programs, though, is that students, particularly minority language students, report that participating in their dual language program is important to them for wanting to stay in school and for wanting to take more advanced math classes. However, studies also suggest that a plateau in language acquisition may occur among students at the secondary level. And this could be due to several different factors, including individual learner differences, students' unwillingness to communicate in the minority language as they progress through the grades, or maybe a lack of precision in evaluation tools. Another possible factor in this plateau is the reduced amount of time in the minority language at the secondary level. So this program requires only 2 classes, which is only about 30% of the students' instruction during the day. Some high schools actually only require 1 class, but still refer to it as immersion. And this program as well, after 11th grade, starting in 11th grade, only requires an AP Spanish class, but students are encouraged to take a second class as well. So Fortune and Teddick suggest in their 2015 study that this reduction may have been one factor that contributed to the low percentage of advanced vocabulary scores among their 8th grade participants in their study. And the low number of classes offered in the minority language at the secondary level also leads some students to not perceive their program as an immersion program, even when the school itself perceives it or calls it an immersion program. And this may in turn lower students' motivation to participate and subsequently lower their academic performance. So it's become increasingly important over the last few decades for students to develop high levels of proficiency in a language or languages other than English in order to compete in the global economy. And students, both minority language students and majority language students, cite this as one of their main motivations for participating in these programs. So in order to help students to achieve these goals, we need a better understanding of what's happening in these secondary programs, particularly of the quality and quantity of minority language that students are producing and are exposed to. So for the DLI students in this study, a math class makes up half of their immersion experience for the year. And as I mentioned, studies of elementary math classes find that students use less Spanish in these classes and seem to have less opportunity to use Spanish, especially extended Spanish. However, the context of a high school is, of course, different than the context of an elementary school. Typically, teachers don't have to worry as much about management, so the structure might be different, and students tend to have a different investment in the minority language than they do when they're younger. So I was curious to know what kinds of opportunities for Spanish use students have in a high school immersion math class, and how they're taking up these opportunities. So I frame this project through sociocultural theory, which states that interaction in the target language is essential for language acquisition. And interaction is using input and output in tandem. So input refers to hearing or reading a sample or content in a language, and output refers to using that language through speaking or writing. And Swain argues that, so not only do scholars argue for the importance of interaction for language acquisition, but Swain argues that for the output, it needs to be extended output. Students need to have an opportunity for extended output in order to really acquire their second language. Interaction may lead to language acquisition in many ways, including providing implicit negative feedback to a learner, or modifications or negotiations when communication breaks down, or development of correct sociolinguistic forms, not just correct grammatical forms, as well as automatizing their output. So this study asks the following questions. What opportunities for Spanish use does the teacher provide during student-to-teacher interactions, and how do students take up these opportunities? What are students' patterns of language use during student-to-student interactions? So I define opportunities as the amount of Spanish speech that a student or students are required to produce as a result of a prompt or question. And I define uptake, or taking up these opportunities, as the amount of Spanish a student or students produced in response to that prompt or question. So as I mentioned, this study takes place in a high school Spanish two-way immersion math class, specifically an advanced algebra class. And the participants in this study were the teacher and 14 of the 15 students that make up this class. 4 of these participants were new to the country from Mexico when this data was collected. And so they were not officially enrolled in the immersion program, but they were taking this class as a way to support their learning. So they were also enrolled in English language learner courses. But this was a way for them to take at least one of their subjects in their native language. And new to the country students, more and more are being placed in these programs, and of course affect the dynamic of the classroom and the language use in the classroom. And so their data was considered important for the study. Only one of the other students who is actually enrolled in the dual language immersion program comes from a Spanish-speaking home, and the other 9 students speak English as their home language. Also, one interesting thing to note about this class is that typically in these programs, which are often referred to as two-way immersion programs, because you've got groups of minority language speakers and groups of majority language speakers. Typically, at least a third of the class should be made up of minority language speakers and at least a third of majority language speakers. So without these new to the country students, this class would actually only have one minority language speaker. It does barely meet the threshold for minority language speakers. The reason this class, because it's an advanced algebra class, draws from many different grade levels. So that might be one reason for having so many more English home language speakers than Spanish home language speakers in this class. So to answer the first research question about what opportunities these students are receiving and how they're taking them up, I relied on the transcriptions of audio recordings of 5 class periods. And to answer my second question about the patterns of language use when students were talking together, I relied on these same transcriptions, but just the interactions of 4 focal students. So analysis for the first question has 2 parts to it. The analysis of the opportunities that the teacher is offering to the students for Spanish use, and then the students' uptake of these opportunities. So to analyze the teacher's speech, I identified each of the C units that she used in these 5 class periods. And a C unit is essentially a sentence or a clause unit. It's an independent clause that can be followed by one or more dependent clauses. And C units are useful for measuring spontaneous speech because they can include fragments in addition to full statements. So each C unit was identified and coded for language, group structure, speech function, and whether or not, or whether it was, if it was a question or a prompt, it was also coded for that, and then given a length, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So just to identify these, group work was anytime the students were asked to work together on a project, and then the student would, or the teacher, sorry, would circulate and help them. And then teacher-fronted time was when the teacher was in front of the whole class giving instruction. So as I mentioned, all of her questions or prompts were given a number. And so they corresponded to the length of answer that she would expect based on what she asked. So for example, a question like, in this case, it would be 4/3, right? Just requires a yes or no. And so that was coded as a 1 because she would only expect a 1-word response to that. Whereas this prompt, con tu equipo habla en un ratito, so with your team, talk for a bit, what do you observe, what do you have questions about? This was one instance of sort of a think, pair, share that she asked them to do. And this kind of response would require at least 2 to 3 sentences. She didn't have any instances of asking for 4 sentences or more explicitly, so I put an example here, but I put it in parentheses just as a possible example. So in order to analyze the second part of this question, the student uptake, the same process was used for student speech. However, the unit of analysis for student speech was the turn. Because while the important part of the teacher's speech was the questions that she was asking, and sometimes she asked more than one question within a turn, often if students weren't responding, she'd keep asking. The important part about student speech was how long their response was. So this was measured in a turn, which is the stream of speech that's produced between the speech of the person that you're talking to. And so these turns were coded also for language, group structure, speech function, and length. And so the same scale was used for length, this time corresponding to how long the student turn was. So a yes or no question, sí or no, would get a 1. A full sentence would get a 3, for example, and so on. So before reporting the findings for the research question, for the first research question, I want to give a general overview of the teacher's language patterns. So during the 5 class periods, She produced 1,112 C units, and a little over half of these occurred during teacher-fronted time. Most of her speech was on task, and almost all of her speech, 98.8%, was in Spanish. Of these 1,112 C units that she produced, 416, so almost 40%, were, or a little more than 30%, were prompts or questions. Only 2 of these were in English, and these were the phrase "yeah," which she used to check for student understanding. And as would be expected based on her general patterns, a little more than half of the opportunities she gave were during teacher-fronted time, and most of them were on task. So one thing to note, though, is that during teacher-fronted time, all of her tokens, all of her C units were recorded and analyzed, but during group work, these come just from the 2 tables where the focal students sat. So comparing these percentages is not as productive as other comparisons. So more productive for this study is the comparison of on-task versus off-task time, and then also the links of opportunities that she was offering to the students. So this chart shows that the opportunities that she offered by link. So again, 1 corresponds to an opportunity to answer with a 1-word response, and a 5 would be 4 sentences or more in response. So since there were only 2 opportunities offered in English, this just shows the Spanish opportunities. And as it shows, the majority of prompts and questions offer opportunities for 1-word responses. And interestingly, the next largest group is for 1-sentence responses. And only 4 opportunities were offered for responses of 2 to 3 sentences. So if we look at the types of opportunities that the teacher offered by group structure, so group work versus teacher-fronted time, we see that most of the opportunities given during both group work and teacher-fronted time were opportunities for 1-word responses. And during teacher-fronted time, the next largest group of opportunities were for short phrases, while during group work, there were more opportunities for full sentence responses, although these numbers themselves are the same. But proportionally, there are more opportunities for 1-sentence responses. The only opportunities for responses of more than 1 sentence were given during teacher-fronted time. So looking at the types of opportunities by speech function, and managing an activity was left off because there were only 2 tokens of that. The teacher gave more opportunities for 1-word responses than any other response, both when on task and off task. And when the conversation was on task, the teacher offered almost equal numbers of opportunities for students to respond with a short phrase or a full sentence, but when the conversation was off task, there were more opportunities for students to respond with a full sentence than with a short phrase. So now looking at the ways that students took up these opportunities, the total number of turns for students that were taking up these opportunities was 314, which is 102 turns lower than would be expected based on how many opportunities were offered. So this discrepancy is likely due to students often responding by nodding their head or shaking their head or shrugging their shoulders, something inaudible. And there may have been several times when they felt like they didn't need to respond because many of the teachers' opportunities were for 1-word responses, and many of those ended in verdad or right or something to indicate just a yes or no. And so they may have started to perceive this as a discourse marker more than an actual question. But of the 314 that were audible, 43 of these were discarded because 30 of them were just a or so it was difficult to attribute them to one language or the other. 4 of them were names in response, and then 3 of them, there was so much switching between Spanish and English that it was difficult to classify them as one or the other. And then 6, I couldn't understand the full response, and so those were discarded as well. So there were 271 remaining tokens of uptake that were analyzed. And the majority of these were in Spanish, and most of them occurred during teacher-fronted time, and most were on task, as we would expect based on the opportunities offered. So looking at the lengths of student speech overall, students produced more turns that were one word long than they did any other length, both in English and in Spanish. They also produced more one-sentence responses than short phrases in both languages. And surprisingly, students produced more turns of two sentences or more when speaking in Spanish than they did in English. So they had 10 turns of two sentences or more in Spanish, but only 2 in English. So looking at the lengths of students' uptake by group structure, most of the students' one-word responses and short phrases occurred during teacher-fronted time, although they produced quite a few one-word responses during group work as well. They also produced almost the same number of one-sentence responses during group work and teacher-fronted time. Most of the English responses, surprisingly, occurred during teacher-fronted time. So now looking at the student uptake when on task and off task, again, managing activity was left off because there were only 2 responses. Most of the English that the students produced was on task. Also, most of the on-task responses were one word long or short phrases, but there were a good number of full sentence responses as well. When off task, one sentence responses were the most common, but one word responses weren't far behind. And this could occur for different reasons, possibly because off-task conversations may have occurred more during group work when the teacher may be closer to them and may feel more inclined to speak in Spanish. But so far, the pattern of student uptake has generally followed the pattern of opportunities that were offered. However, it's important to note that during group work, students produced 8 responses of 2 sentences or longer, even though the teacher did not explicitly offer opportunities for this. And this type of uptake might be attributed to the nature of the teacher's questions during group work. It happened a little bit during teacher-fronted time as well, but sometimes during group work, she would ask questions that by themselves should elicit a one-word response, but they would be asked in a series, and so together they acted as a prompt for the student to answer with a couple full sentences. So for example, one time she asked one of the students, do you want to talk about that, or do you not want to participate, or how are we doing? And so she responded, no, yeah, it's fine, but I'm already participating, right? And so even though explicitly each of these questions might require only one word in response, together they act to elicit a longer response. So just to summarize, almost all of the opportunities for speech were offered in Spanish, and students' verbal uptake was mostly in Spanish. English was used by students more frequently during teacher-fronted time and when on task. And this may be because there were some instances of students explaining their answer in Spanish, but then if there was a pause, they would then re-explain in English. So they may have been unsure whether the pause was because they weren't being understood, or they may have just felt like they weren't communicating well. The majority of opportunities offered were for one-word responses and short phrases, and students took up these opportunities by responding with one-word short phrases and sometimes 2 or more sentences. So to answer the second question, what are students' patterns of language use during student-to-student interactions? 4 focal students were identified, and Jorge is the Spanish home language student in the class who was enrolled in the dual language immersion program. Courtney is an English home language student who's considered highly proficient by her teacher. Emily is also English home language, who's considered fairly proficient, but not quite as proficient as Courtney. And then Marisol is one of the new to the country students who's enrolled in the ELL program. So to analyze the speech patterns of these 4 students, I coded their turns the same way I did for the student-teacher interactions but I added the category of before class to group structure because the teacher she would often sit at her desk before class, and so at least on the recordings, there were not opportunities for student-teacher interactions before class, but there were quite a bit of there was some interaction between students before class. So for these students, I identified 1,305 turns during the 5 class periods, and of these turns, a little over half were in Spanish. Nearly all of the focal student speech occurred during group work, while 12% of their turns occurred during teacher-fronted time and less than 3% occurred before class. The majority of student speech was on task, and nearly a third was off task, with the remaining 2% being dedicated to managing activities. So as this chart shows, most of their student, I split it between student to student and student teacher interactions for comparison. So most of their speech was with each other, but there was quite a bit of speech with, between the focal students and the teacher. When they were talking with the teacher, they almost exclusively used Spanish, but when they were talking with each other, this is more divided between Spanish and English. They used mostly full sentences with each other, which would be expected of conversational speech. But they also had quite a few short phrases and some longer phrases too. It is interesting that there is more Spanish than English used for some of these terms, but when talking in full sentences, there's more English use. As this chart shows, most of the students' interactions with the teacher occurred during teacher-fronted time, but 8% of group work was used for talking with the teacher. During teacher-fronted time, students also had some side conversations that made up 22% of their speech. And like I said, the teacher usually sat at her desk, so there weren't before class turns with the teacher. Looking at students' interactions with each other, one interesting pattern is that they use more Spanish than English during group work as a whole, as a group, which contradicts findings from previous studies. Before class, as a group, they nearly always spoke in English, and then during teacher-fronted time, mostly in Spanish. Another interesting pattern to note is that there was more Spanish than English used for all 3 speech functions. And this also contradicts previous studies that indicate that students tend to use more English than Spanish when off task and when managing an activity. So these findings, of course, are better understood when looking at the individual language use patterns of these 4 students because they represent different linguistic backgrounds and profiles. So again, Jorge is the Spanish home language student. Courtney and Emily are English home language students, and Marisol is a Spanish home language student. I'm sorry, she's a new to the country student. So here I've listed some of the major trends in the students' speech as a group, and then listed beneath in red some contributing factors. So as a group, students used almost equal amounts of Spanish and English with each other. Many of the English turns were contributed by Emily and Jorge, while Emily contributed less than 20% of the total turns for these vocal students. Almost 70% of her turns were in English. Jorge also mostly spoke in English, and his turns, his English turns made up 62% of his speech. Courtney's English and Spanish use was more balanced. And Marisol spoke almost exclusively in Spanish. She only had 3 tokens of English in her speech. So her Spanish use certainly contributes to the high amount of Spanish shown for the group. She contributed almost 1/4 of the total turns for the group, and all of those were in Spanish. Many of her turns were more than 1 sentence in length. She and her table partner, who was also new to the country, would often chat while they were working. And a lot of her turns were 3-4 sentences long. So this contributed to the group trend of having more longer turns more often be in Spanish than in English. She really used short phrases, but Courtney did because she often answered questions during teacher-fronted time. And so she contributed a lot of the short turns, or short phrases, I'm sorry, that were in Spanish. So Courtney and Marisol together contributed to the high amount of Spanish use during group work. Together, their Spanish turns during group work made up almost 60% of group work turns. There we go. Takes a bit. As a group, there were more Spanish turns than English turns during all of the speech functions, and Marisol contributed about a third of the off-task turns, and all of them in Spanish, while Jorge and Courtney contributed 2/3 of the managing and activity turns, also all in Spanish. So they, all of these though, interestingly occurred during one class period, and it was one of the first class periods that I was there, excuse me, recording. So that may have been a factor in them using Spanish. They used a lot of Spanish during that particular class, and may have contributed to them using so much Spanish in managing activity. But they also sat with a couple of new to the country students, and so it could have just been the nature of their interactions that day. So this group showed a tendency to use English before class, more English and Spanish before class. All of these English turns were contributed by Courtney and Jorge. Marisol always used Spanish before class. All of her turns were in Spanish. And then Emily did not have any turns before class. So the first conclusion that can be drawn from this study is that, as previous study shows in this math class, students can often get by without using complex verbs or complex sentences, I'm sorry, that involve a verb. And when the teacher is talking to students, there are few opportunities given for extended output and few instances of students producing extended output. When the students speak with each other, their output is a little more extended, but it's still limited to mostly turns of one sentence or less. This is typical of conversational speech, as I mentioned. The exception is the new to the country student, Marisol, who, as I mentioned, produced several turns that were longer, 2 sentences or longer. As in studies of elementary Spanish immersion classes, off-task speech was often in English, except for Marisol's speech, which was almost exclusively in Spanish. However, in this class, the teacher sometimes offered the students opportunities to use Spanish in off-task conversations, and the students took up many of these opportunities by responding in Spanish with a full sentence. So this is something that's probably more typical in a high school setting where the teacher doesn't have to worry as much about class management and maybe can relate better to her students and can chat with them without worrying that the students are going to get totally off topic and not still be working. So this pattern didn't seem to encourage students to use Spanish with each other when they were off task, but it does provide a model for students that counters their tendency to use English when off task and creates and counters this idea of a diglossic situation where English is used for off task and Spanish for on task or academic purposes. So it supports Fortune's claim that the use of Spanish for academic purposes and English for socializing is nuanced and may be affected by many factors. In this study, as in previous studies, when talking to the teacher, the students primarily use Spanish. However, individual differences definitely play a role in students' language use because when talking with each other, one English home language student and one Spanish home language student, the Spanish home language student primarily used English, but the other English home language student and the new to the country student primarily used Spanish. So for Courtney and Marisol, who primarily used Spanish, proficiency in Courtney's case and language dominance in Marisol's case might have played a role in their use of Spanish over English. Table partners also likely influenced their language use. So Courtney sat between Jorge, the Spanish home language student, and a new to the country student, and there was another new to the country student at their table. And Marisol sat next to another new to the country student and talked almost exclusively with her. Emily's high use of English was also likely influenced by her table partner, at least to some extent. At one point, her partner, Anna, spoke in Spanish, and Emily told her to use English so that my study would be more accurate, telling Anna, "You never use Spanish." Jorge's language use was the most surprising, since he reported to me that he feels more comfortable using Spanish. And he sat next to Courtney, who sometimes stayed in Spanish even when he responded in English. But studies do show that Spanish dominant students or Spanish home language students will often favor English over Spanish because of its social currency. So this may be a factor as well. The next step in the study is to look at what other individual differences contribute to the students' patterns of language use. So specifically, I'll be looking at students' scores on an elicited imitation task to better assess their proficiency in a more systematic way. I will also analyze interviews with students, with their parents, and with the teacher in order to better understand these students' motivation and their willingness to communicate. So the first implication of this study is that in this DLI program, the students need more opportunities for extended Spanish use. So although this study doesn't explore language outcomes, based on findings from other studies, without more opportunities for extended Spanish use, these students may experience the plateau effect that some other studies have found. If they take only 2 content classes per year in Spanish, and in this class they have little opportunity for extended language use, this may not be enough to help them continue developing a robust Spanish vocabulary, and by extension, to continue developing their reading and writing skills. However, it's important that this DLI program consider what its goals are, and whether those are to simply maintain the language, which still may be difficult with this amount of language exposure, or whether they want students to achieve the high levels of bilingualism and biliteracy, high academic achievement, and cultural competence that are the goals of dual language immersion programs. In talking with the teacher, it seems that one factor in this program may be that for a long time, or I guess parents were asking for this program to be continued into high school, and one reason for the creation of this program was because parents were asking, and it may be that the goals of the program have not been fully articulated yet. So the program may want to take a closer look at the classes that make up the immersion program for each year, and the language that's being produced in those, and especially if they want to, especially if the goal is to achieve those high proficiency or high levels of bilingualism and biliteracy that are the goals of DLI, and especially since these students have the opportunity to prepare for receiving awards like the Seal of Biliteracy. And so they may want to, in addition looking into these classes, consider adding a 3rd class per year if that's feasible. That can be very tricky. Also, the structure for this math class is 2 minutes of group work for every 1 minute of teacher-fronted time, and this seems to give students a good opportunity to engage in more conversation and longer turns for a large portion of the class. And another way that the teacher could promote even more extended Spanish use is by offering opportunities for students to discuss topics or specific problems in pairs, and then share their results and explain their reasoning. So maybe a think, pair, share format. So there was one instance of this during the 5 class periods observed, and it did prompt conversations between students that included turns of 2 to 3 sentences and an answer to the teacher in front of the class that was 2 to 3 sentences long. So presentational speech by nature tends to be longer than conversational speech. And so these opportunities to present findings and reasonings are important for promoting extended Spanish use, and by extension, complex Spanish use that requires the use of multiple verbs. Another way to possibly promote Spanish use is to indicate with questions that a 1-sentence response, a full sentence response is required, things like that. So finally, the teacher should continue modeling the use of Spanish when talking about off-task topics. Increase reminders to students to use Spanish or even incentives may also help, although these can be difficult to implement and tiresome to teachers. But in their interviews, students reported that they felt that they got reminders to use Spanish a lot, but there were no reminders in these 5 class periods, and I didn't have any notes or recall any other reminders during the other class periods that I observed. Some more reminders to students to say in Spanish may also help. Encouraging these students to increase their use of Spanish as well as increasing their opportunities for lengthy Spanish will contribute to their ability to continue developing their linguistic and sociolinguistic skills, which may in turn increase their motivation and their enjoyment of their program. Thank you.
Thanks, Lauren. That's a lot of really interesting and robust data that you have. It seems like there's so much you could do with that. I was really interested in the finding about related to teacher talk, and it's very consistent. These sort of low opportunities for extended discourse is really consistent with research in upper level post-secondary foreign language classrooms where students have very little opportunity for extended discourse, and it's dominated by more teacher talk. So I just thought it was really interesting to be able to see those parallels. So there's a couple of questions in the chat already. Ormania had a question about the demographics of your learners, and I think maybe the question that Corey asked will help address Orania's question. So I'm just going to ask Corey's question, and that was, did you see any patterns in the data for the first research question in terms of whether the students were English home language or recent arrivals? And you could also add Spanish home language, not recent arrival to that. If you want to kind of can you maybe address that question?
So maybe their uptake, whether that depended on their home language. So yes. So
and their time in the U.S.
Marisol, the new to the country student, always answered the teacher in Spanish. I'm forgetting. She had one instance where she said "yeah" in English, or it sounded more English than Spanish. And I don't think the teacher was her interlocutor though at that point, but I don't remember. Jorge almost always answered the teacher in Spanish, but he did have a couple instances of shouting out an answer, but short answers in English. So like one time, I think the teacher asked, "Is everyone ready?" And he just said, "Nope." So things like that, but they were very short. And then Emily almost always answered in Spanish when it was teacher fronted, but during group time, she would usually use English even with the teacher. Courtney used Spanish almost always with the teacher, whether during group work or teacher fronted time.
Okay, thanks, Lauren. So there's one more question in the chat that I'm going to ask, but I'm just going to remind folks, we welcome you to ask questions in the chat or to raise your hand if you prefer to ask your question orally. So the next question is from Martha, and she asks, did you monitor for group dynamics in terms of who initiated and who dominated interactions? Were the groups pairs or larger? Were native speakers purposefully paired with English home language students?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have a sense of who dominated conversations. I did not systematically account for that, but that is something that I do want to think about when describing. So this next part, this third question, we'll talk about individual differences and dynamics. So that is a really good point to think of. Thank you. As far as who they were sitting with, the teacher described to me that it had been a long process of figuring out who could work with whom, because there were some tensions between groups of students. There were some tensions between some of the new to the country students and also new to the country, and I think maybe just between the new to the country students. And then there were other tensions. There had been some drama earlier in the year, and so the groups as they were formed were more based on interpersonal dynamics rather than language dynamics. But it is interesting that new to the country students, well, all the Spanish language speakers, minority language speakers ended up at two tables. So then there were two tables of students that were just English home language speakers. One of them also spoke Vietnamese at home. So yeah, so that did create sort of a, maybe uneven dynamic linguistically.
And they self-selected that way?
Sort of, yeah. Self-selected slash teacher moved, I think, kind of a combination, yeah. Did I answer the second question?
Were they groups or pairs? Were the groups pairs or larger?
So there were three or four at each table, and typically there wasn't a lot of instruction about whether to work with the whole table or just the person next to you. Typically, I noticed at the table where Emily and Marisol sat, Emily and Anna worked together almost 100% of the time, except once when Marisol asked them a question. And then Marisol and Camila, the other new to the country student, always worked together exclusively. At the other table, there was a little more conversation between Courtney, Jorge, and another new to the country student. And then the other new to the country student that was sitting at that table was fairly quiet, so he mostly just listened and sometimes worked with one of them. So it was kind of, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a couple more questions. The first one's from Stephanie, and I think it'll lead in nicely to Blair's question. So Stephanie's question is, was there any evidence of scaffolding output with language-focused instruction? I assume, Stephanie, you mean by the teacher. So again, the question, was there any evidence of scaffolding output with language-focused instruction, and in parentheses, framed, of course, by the content of algebra?
Mm-hmm. Within these 5 class periods, no. From what I recall from all of the observations, there were a couple of times where the teacher did introduce a term that not everyone knew. But there were also several times that the teacher asked students for translations of some terms. And she made a concerted effort to understand what students' math background was, like the students that were new to the country. She would ask them about what terms they used, if this was very different from their approach, the approach that their schools had used before they came to the United States, but there wasn't really structured, linguistic output. Mm-hmm. Great question.
So Blair's question is also about linguistic development. And so he asks, given that there were essentially no opportunities for advanced/paragraph level speech in this class, do you think that it's even possible to structure math classes to stimulate advanced level output? Or should immersion programs look to other content areas to develop advanced level language skills?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I agree. I think Stephanie's maybe leads into that because I think that would be a great way, right, to scaffold that output. Also, I was just talking with with a couple of colleagues about this, about the possibly asking students to think out loud, to explain their processes, right, and then to have the teacher do the same to model that, to think out loud, or I guess as she's going through a problem, to talk about what processes she's using, so that the students then have that model to then use themselves. So that could be one way, but it is more difficult, of course, yeah, in a math class.
Well, in my understanding of immersion education, it's very limited. So my apologies to folks who are immersion experts on this call, is that there is this sort of push-pull between a focus on content and a focus on language, and that it's very difficult to find that balance, just as it is in upper level language classes, in foreign language departments at universities, right? You want to focus more on the content because you see that as your primary objective as the teacher, but then language development can sometimes take a back seat to that.
Definitely, and especially with a class like this, because this is an advanced algebra class that draws from many different grade levels. But that means that there are only 15 students who have, I guess, qualified for this class. And so it's very imbalanced in terms of numbers with other classes, which makes it hard to then be consistent, because there's just, in one of the other classes, there were 30 students. And there were there was more of a, I think there was more of a balance and maybe even more minority language students. But the teacher talked about how it's just so busy and it was hard to get through the material. And so that's a constraint, right? Is to add then on top of that a focus on helping the students develop their language. It's very difficult.
So we have one last question. I think we have just enough time to ask and answer it. So this is from Ormania, and this sounds like it's related to what you're going to be doing next in your project in terms of your data analysis. So you may not be able to fully respond to it. But the question is, were there times that you observed where the students were reluctant to communicate in either Spanish or English? And what was the role of the teacher in engaging them and motivating them to use the Spanish, the language of instruction?
Mm-hmm. I don't know that I noticed a reluctance. Some students, of course, were quieter than others, like Emily tended to be quieter, but I didn't notice a reluctance with talking with the teacher. She had a very good rapport with her students. It was a very, there was a lot of camaraderie, I think, in the class, especially between the teacher and the students. And as she would wander, she would check up on everyone and see if they needed help, but also chat with them about their extracurricular activities, ask them questions, sometimes cultural questions. There was actually one of the students who wasn't one of the focal students, but she seemed to try to engage in conversations with him. She was asking sometimes, or at one point, about his background in Mexico in math and like what books he used, because she was wanting resources so she could better understand the different approaches. And his responses tended to be very short, and I wasn't sure if maybe he was shy but it wasn't a language issue. So I'm sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
Was the teacher what was the teacher doing anything to get students motivated or engaged?
Other than just engaging with students one-on-one, and I felt like every student probably felt seen, because she definitely engaged with every student, but I didn't notice reminders to speak in Spanish or indications that she wanted them to speak in Spanish. And so sometimes they would just chat with her in English, but she almost always stayed in Spanish, which did, as I pointed out earlier, prompt them to stay in Spanish a lot of times, even when they were talking about off-task topics. So.
Well, thanks so much, Lauren. We're right at 1 o'clock, so excellent timing today. And it's just so thrilling to hear about your dissertation research, and we wish you luck with the drafting of the rest of your chapters. We're also really glad that all of you came here today to listen to this talk and to ask such good questions. I'm particularly delighted to see so many folks from BYU here today. These are Lauren's new colleagues. She's going to be taking a job there starting in June. Lauren, I hope you don't mind that I've just outed you in this public forum. So thank you all, the BYU folks, for being here. And thanks to the rest of you too. We hope to see you at the next CARLA talk. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.